High in the forgotten hills of Appalachia, where poverty clings to the mountainside like morning mist, young Thomas trudges barefoot along a muddy path. His thin shoulders, exposed to the autumn chill, bear the weight of both the medicine bundle and the desperate hope it represents. Hours earlier, he'd surrendered his only coat to the town apothecary, the final possession worth trading for his mother's medicine. Now, wearing nothing but tattered overalls, he shivers against the wind's bite, determined to make it home before nightfall claims these woods. A mile ahead, a polished carriage rounds the bend, its gleaming wood and brass fittings stark against the humble landscape. Inside sits Edmund Blackwell, whose railroad fortunes could purchase this entire county without denting his accounts. What could possibly connect these two souls from worlds so distant they might as well inhabit different planets? Would the wealthy man's momentary pause become the turning point that changes both their destinies forever? The cabin perched precariously on the mountainside, its weathered logs darkened by decades of rain and snow. Smoke curled lazily from a stone chimney, the only sign of life in this remote hollow where the nearest neighbor lived, 3 miles down the winding dirt path. Inside, Sarah Mason lay beneath a patchwork quilt, her thin fingers tracing the irregular stitches that held together scraps from her husband's shirts, Thomas's baby clothes, and remnants of curtains from happier times. Each piece told a story. This blue square from John's Sunday shirt, this faded red from the dress she wore when Thomas was born. The quilt was both family album and final comfort. Thomas, her voice barely carried across the single room that served as kitchen, bedroom, and living area combined. No answer came. The cabin held only silence, broken by the occasional crack of burning pine and the steady drip from a corner of the roof that never dried properly after the last big storm. Sarah's eyes drifted to the small shelf that held their remaining possessions, a Bible with pages soft from daily reading, a chipped teapot, 3 mismatched cups, and a framed tintype showing a younger version of herself alongside John, his arm protectively around her shoulders. Thomas had been just a bump beneath her apron then. John, gone 5 winters now, buried up on the ridge where the sunrise hit first. The mountain had claimed him like it claimed so many men, his lungs finally surrendering after 15 years in the coal mines. The company had provided 3 months' wages as compensation before evicting them from the company house in town. This cabin had been John's father's hunting shelter once. They'd patched it as best they could, but winter always found new ways to creep in. Sarah's gaze traveled to the walls where Thomas had stuffed moss and mud into the widening gaps between logs. Her boy was nothing if not resourceful. A coughing fit seized her, and Sarah pressed a rag to her mouth. When she pulled it away, fresh spots of crimson stained the cloth. She quickly tucked it beneath the quilt before Thomas could see. He carried enough burdens. The cough had started last autumn. By Christmas, she couldn't manage the walk to the spring without stopping to catch her breath. Now, in late March, even sitting upright required more strength than she could often muster. Thomas had taken over everything, hauling water, chopping wood, tending their small vegetable patch, and even preparing the simple meals their poverty afforded. At 13, he moved with the practiced efficiency of a man 3 times his age, his childhood sacrificed to survival. Sarah's heart ached, watching him shoulder responsibilities no child should bear. The coal company's school had closed to him once John died, and they moved beyond town limits. Instead, she had taught him to read from the Bible and cipher basic numbers by lamplight. Thomas absorbed knowledge hungrily, often walking miles to borrow dog-eared books from the circuit preacher. The door creaked open, and Sarah quickly closed her eyes, pretending sleep. It was only the wind. Thomas wouldn't return for hours yet. She'd sent him to town with John's coat, their last possession of any value, hoping the apothecary would trade it for medicine. The decision had torn at her. That coat was Thomas's most treasured inheritance, the only physical reminder of his father besides the quilt scraps. Outside, fat snowflakes began drifting past the single small window. Sarah's worry deepened. The spring storms were unpredictable, and fierce, sweeping down from higher elevations without warning. Thomas would be caught in it, returning home. Worse, he would be without the coat. "Lord," she whispered, pulling the quilt tighter, "watch over my boy." The quilt provided what warmth it could, each piece a memory, each stitch an act of love. Sarah had started it during her first pregnancy, a child lost before Thomas. She'd finished it during the lonely nights after John's passing. Now it might well cover her in her final days, if the medicine didn't help. Her fingers found a patch of blue cotton, worn smooth from years of touching, John's wedding shirt. "Give me strength," she murmured to it, "just a little longer." For Thomas, the cabin waited in silence as the snow continued to fall. Thomas clutched the wool coat to his chest as he navigated the steep, muddy path toward town. The garment was heavy with memories, its fabric worn smooth at the elbows and cuffs from his father's years of honest labor. "You'll grow into it someday," John had said on Thomas's 10th birthday, draping the massive coat around his son's narrow shoulders. Even now, 3 years later, the sleeves extended well past Thomas's fingertips, and the hem hung below his knees. That evening his father had coughed blood for the first time. 2 months later, he was gone. Thomas paused at the ridge overlooking the valley, the same spot where they'd buried his father. From here, he could see the town nestled between the protective embrace of the mountains, smoke rising from chimneys in the chill spring air. The mining company's black buildings dominated the southern edge, a constant reminder of what had killed his father and driven them to poverty. His fingers traced the hand-sewn patch on the inside pocket, where his mother had mended a tear. Her stitches formed his father's initials, J.M., a hidden message of love. Thomas swallowed hard. The coat was the only thing of value they had left, and now he would trade it away. "I'm sorry, Pa," he whispered to the wind. As he descended toward town, memories surfaced with each step. His father teaching him to set rabbit snares while wearing this coat. The Christmas when John had wrapped Thomas in it after the boy had fallen through creek ice. The familiar scent of pipe tobacco and pine that still clung faintly to the wool. Even years later, the town appeared largely unchanged since their departure. The general store, the company offices, the church where they'd held his father's funeral service. People moved along the single muddy street, most averting their eyes as Thomas passed. The mining town held little sympathy for those who'd fallen on hard times. There were too many widows, too many fatherless children. Thomas made his way to the apothecary at the far end of the street. Mr. Simmons was known to be tight with money, but fair in his dealings. The bell above the door announced Thomas's arrival. The warm, medicinal smell of the shop a stark contrast to the damp spring air outside. "Young Mason," Simmons acknowledged from behind the counter, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "What brings you down the mountain?" "Ma's getting worse, sir," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the emotion rising in his throat. "The cough medicine you gave us last month is gone, and she's not improving." The apothecary's eyes softened slightly. "I warned you that consumption doesn't heal quickly, boy. She needs proper doctoring, not just cough syrup." "Yes, sir, but the doctor won't come without payment up front." Thomas took a deep breath and placed the coat on the counter. "I was hoping you might trade for more medicine, something stronger." Simmons picked up the coat, examining it with practiced hands. "Your father's?" Thomas nodded, unable to speak. The apothecary sighed, running his fingers along the quality wool, testing the stitching, checking for moths. "It's seen better days, but it's still good material." He looked at Thomas with something approaching compassion. "You realize you'll have nothing to keep warm with when winter comes again. Ma won't see winter if I don't get her help now." Simmons's expression darkened as he studied the boy's determined face. He moved to a shelf behind the counter and selected a dark bottle. "This is stronger than what I gave you before. French formula. It won't cure her, but it might ease her suffering and give her strength." He added a smaller vial beside it. "And this is for fever. 3 drops, only, mind you, in tea or water." Thomas reached for the medicine, but Simmons held it back. "Boy, what you need is a real doctor and better food, not just medicine. This coat isn't worth both bottles." Thomas stood his ground. "It's all we have left to trade, Mr. Simmons." A long moment passed between them, the only sound the tick of the shop clock. "Take both," Simmons finally said, pushing the bottles forward. "And this," he added, a small paper bag. "Beef broth powder. Mix it with hot water. Your mother needs strength." Thomas stared at the unexpected generosity. "Go on now," Simmons said gruffly, folding the coat. "Storm's coming in. You'll want to be home before dark." Thomas carefully placed the bottles in his overall pocket, clutching the paper bag. "Thank you, sir." "Don't thank me," Simmons muttered. "Just get home safe." Thomas stepped back into the biting wind, now without even a coat to shield him from the elements. Somewhere above, he imagined his father watching, understanding the sacrifice made in his name. The small glass bottle felt impossibly heavy in Thomas's pocket as he left town behind. Its dark amber surface promised relief, perhaps even salvation. The apothecary's words echoed in his mind. "It won't cure her, but it might ease her suffering." Thomas clenched his jaw against the creeping doubt. It had to be enough. He had nothing left to trade if it wasn't. Dark clouds gathered overhead, mirroring his troubled thoughts. The wind cut through his thin cotton shirt, and he hunched his shoulders against the chill. Without his father's coat, every gust reached bone deep. Thomas kept his eyes fixed on the muddy path and quickened his pace. He knew these mountains intimately, where the first wild ginseng would appear in late spring, which south-facing slopes harbored wild berries, which bark could be boiled for pain relief. His mother had taught him the mountain's secrets since he could walk. Knowledge passed down through generations of Appalachian folk who lived far from doctors and hospitals. Thomas paused at a familiar grove and knelt beside a patch of fresh green shoots. Carefully, he dug around a young bloodroot plant, exposing its red-orange rhizome. His mother had shown him how its sap could help with her cough when mixed with honey. He wrapped the precious root in a scrap of cloth and tucked it into his pocket alongside the medicine bottles. The first raindrops began to fall as he climbed higher. Thomas knew he should seek shelter. The mountain storms turned dangerous quickly, but home was still miles away. His mother would be waiting, perhaps watching the window, growing more concerned with each passing minute. The thought spurred him onward despite the worsening weather. His mind drifted to memories of his mother before illness had claimed her strength. Sarah Mason had once been the most capable woman in these hills. She could shoot a squirrel at 50 paces, preserve enough vegetables to last the winter, and still find time to teach Thomas his letters by firelight. Now she struggled even to sit upright without coughing. The consumption had changed everything. Thomas had watched helplessly as the illness transformed his vibrant mother into a ghost of herself. Each coughing fit seemed to take another piece of her away, leaving behind a fragile shell that frightened him more than he dared admit. "You have your father's stubbornness," she often told him when he insisted on doing everything himself. But Thomas knew the truth. He had her strength, her refusal to surrender even when circumstances seemed hopeless. The rain intensified, plastering his shirt to his skin. The path turned treacherous, mud sucking at his bare feet with each step. Twice he slipped, catching himself against trees to avoid tumbling down the steep incline. The second time he felt the medicine bottle shift in his pocket and froze in terror, patting frantically to ensure it remained intact. The glass was cold but unbroken beneath his fingers. Thomas exhaled shakily. The bottle represented everything: his father's coat, his mother's chance, their future. A flash of lightning illuminated the mountainside, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very ground. Thomas knew he should find shelter, but the thought of his mother waiting drove him forward. Each minute he delayed was another minute she suffered without relief. The next lightning strike hit closer, splitting a pine tree not 50 yards ahead. The crack and crash sent birds scattering into the stormy sky. Thomas stumbled backward, heart pounding. The rational part of his mind screamed to seek cover, but home was just over the next ridge. He pressed his hand against the pocket holding the precious medicine bottle. Just a little further, he murmured, whether to himself or the storm, he wasn't certain. The path narrowed as it wound around a rocky outcropping. Thomas edged forward carefully, the drop to his right now hidden by sheets of rain. His bare feet found little purchase on the slick stone. One misstep would mean disaster, not just for him but for his mother, waiting alone in their cabin. Another lightning strike, another deafening crash of thunder. Thomas flinched, lost his balance for a heart-stopping moment, then steadied himself against the rock face. The rain seemed determined to wash him off the mountain entirely. Through the curtain of water he spotted a fallen log bridging a section of washed-out path ahead. There was no alternative route. He would have to cross it, or turn back. Thomas took a deep breath and patted the medicine bottle once more. "Pa," he whispered, "help me get this home to Ma." With that prayer offered to the storm, Thomas stepped onto the slippery log and began to inch his way across the chasm. Edmund Blackwell adjusted his silk cravat and consulted the gold pocket watch that had accompanied him through 30 years of business ventures. The timepiece, engraved with his initials and adorned with a diamond at the 12, had been his first significant purchase after his railroad investments paid dividends. It symbolized everything he had accomplished: precision, value, and the mastery of time itself. "We're approximately 7 miles from the Westridge property, sir," his driver called down from the exposed perch of the carriage. "Road conditions are deteriorating with the approaching storm." Edmund nodded curtly, though the driver couldn't see the gesture. "Proceed with caution, Phillips. We must reach Coleridge Junction by nightfall." The elegant carriage, with its polished mahogany exterior and velvet upholstered interior, seemed laughably out of place on the primitive mountain roads. Edmund had insisted on bringing his personal vehicle rather than using the local transportation options. Appearance mattered in business, especially when negotiating the purchase of an entire valley. He returned the watch to his waistcoat pocket and turned his attention to the document spread across his lap. Maps of the region, property surveys, and preliminary contracts awaited his final review. The expansion of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad through these mountains would connect the coal mines directly to eastern markets, dramatically increasing profits while eliminating dependence on river transport. It was a brilliant strategy, though not without obstacle. Local landowners had proven surprisingly resistant to his generous offers. These mountain people held peculiar attachments to their hard-scrabble plots, preferring poverty on ancestral land to prosperity elsewhere. The carriage hit a particularly deep rut, jostling Edmund and disarranging his papers. He frowned, gathering them with manicured hands that hadn't seen manual labor in decades. "My apologies, sir," Phillips called. "The rain is making the road treacherous." Edmund sighed and closed his leather portfolio. The view outside his window revealed little beyond grey skies and endless trees clinging to steep hillsides. How anyone could choose to live in such isolation baffled him. His own childhood in Philadelphia's industrial district had been characterized by crowded tenements and sooty air, but at least there had been people, opportunities, and civilization. He had escaped those beginnings through intelligence, determination, and an almost preternatural ability to identify profitable ventures before others recognized their potential. By 30, he had accumulated more wealth than his immigrant father had seen in a lifetime of factory work. By 40, his name appeared alongside Vanderbilt's and Carnegie's in financial publications. Now, at 57, Edmund Blackwell's signature on a contract could alter the fortunes of entire communities. The pocket watch ticked steadily against his chest, each second marking another opportunity seized or lost. Time was the one commodity he couldn't acquire more of, regardless of his wealth. A flash of lightning illuminated the desolate landscape, followed by a rumble of thunder that seemed to shake the very mountains. The rain intensified, drumming against the carriage roof with increasing urgency. "Sir," Phillips called, his voice barely audible above the storm, "we should seek shelter until this passes. Edmund checked his watch again, a habit so ingrained he often did it unconsciously. 3:15. The meeting with the mining executives was scheduled for 7 o'clock. Unacceptable. Continue on. The order felt hollow, even as he issued it. Edmund knew Phillips was right. Pressing forward in such conditions was foolhardy. Yet the thought of delay irritated him beyond reason. His entire life had been orchestrated around efficiency and precise timing. As the carriage lurched forward, Edmund's thoughts drifted unwillingly to Elizabeth. She would have laughed at his rigid adherence to schedules, just as she had during their 23 years of marriage. "The world won't end if dinner is served at 7:05 instead of 7, she would tease, her eyes crinkling at the corners. The memory caused a familiar ache in his chest. 3 years since the influenza had taken her, and still the emptiness remained. Their massive Boston estate now felt like a mausoleum, each room haunted by her absence. Perhaps that explained his increased business travel of late. The constant motion kept grief at bay. Another lightning strike, closer this time. The horses whinnied in fear, and the carriage slowed. Sir Phillips tried again. "The animals are spooked." "We can't safely—" "Very well," Edmund interrupted, his tone clipped. "Find suitable shelter, but we depart the moment conditions improve." As Phillips guided the carriage toward a stand of trees, offering minimal protection, Edmund consulted his watch one last time. The diamond caught the dim light, sparkling like a distant star. Time continued its relentless march forward, caring nothing for storms, grief, or railroad expansions. Edmund snapped the watch closed with a decisive click. This delay was merely a temporary setback, nothing more. The storm unleashed its full fury upon the mountains. Sheets of rain reduced visibility to mere yards, and wind howled through the pines like a living thing. Thomas clung to the narrow path, one hand pressed against the rocky mountainside for balance, the other clutched protectively over the pocket containing his mother's medicine. His cotton shirt, soaked through, offered no protection against the chill. Each gust sent violent shivers through his thin frame. Thomas set his jaw against the cold and pressed forward. Every step brought him closer to home, closer to his mother. The path curved sharply around a boulder, and Thomas nearly collided with the massive chestnut horses that had appeared suddenly through the curtain of rain. He stumbled backward, slipping in the mud, and barely catching himself before tumbling down the steep embankment. "Whoa there!" A man's voice cut through the storm's roar. Thomas looked up, blinking rain from his eyes, to see an ornate carriage unlike anything that usually traveled these mountain roads. The driver, hunched against the elements, struggled to control the nervous horses. "Boy, are you hurt?" the driver called down. Thomas shook his head, unable to find his voice. The carriage door swung open, and a face appeared. An older man with a neatly trimmed beard, streaked with grey, wearing clothes finer than Thomas had ever seen up close. "Phillips, what's the delay?" The man's authoritative voice carried easily despite the storm. "There's a boy on the path, Mr. Blackwell. Nearly ran him down." The man called Blackwell squinted through the rain at Thomas, his expression shifting from annoyance to surprise. "Good heavens, child, where are your clothes in this weather?" Thomas straightened, conscious of his appearance, barefoot, dressed only in threadbare overalls and a soaked cotton shirt that clung to his bony shoulders. "I'm headed home, sir," he managed, his voice steady despite his chattering teeth. "Just need to pass by your horses." Blackwell's eyes narrowed with curiosity. "Where is home?" "There's nothing for miles in this direction. Cabin's just over that ridge, sir." Thomas pointed vaguely toward the next mountain rise. "If you'll excuse me, my mother's waiting." He made to move past the carriage, but Blackwell's voice stopped him. "Wait, boy, you'll catch your death in this storm." The man seemed genuinely concerned, though clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "What's your name?" "Thomas Mason, sir." "Well, Thomas Mason, I can't in good conscience leave a child to walk miles in this deluge. Perhaps we can offer you transport." Thomas hesitated. His mother had always warned him about accepting charity. Pride was often the only possession poor folk could claim without question. Yet the medicine in his pocket needed to reach her, and his strength was failing in the cold. "Thank you, sir, but your fine carriage won't make it up the logging trail to our place." Blackwell tugged at his beard thoughtfully. "At minimum, come inside until the worst pass. You're blue with cold." A flash of lightning followed immediately by a tremendous crack of thunder decided the matter. The horses reared in terror, nearly overturning the carriage. Phillips fought to control them as Blackwell braced himself against the doorframe. "Get in, boy, quickly," Blackwell commanded, extending his hand. Thomas hesitated only a moment longer before grasping the offered hand. The man's grip was surprisingly strong as he pulled Thomas into the carriage's opulent interior. The sudden absence of rain and wind was so jarring that Thomas stood frozen, dripping water onto the velvet floor. "Sit, please," Blackwell said, gesturing to the bench opposite his own. "Before you soak the entire compartment." Thomas perched awkwardly on the edge of the seat, acutely aware of the muddy water pooling beneath his bare feet. The carriage interior smelled of leather, tobacco, and expensive cologne, scents entirely foreign to his world of wood smoke and pine. "Phillips," Blackwell called to his driver, "find shelter where the horses can be properly secured." "Yes, sir." The carriage lurched forward, seeking more substantial protection than the exposed mountain path. Thomas instinctively reached for his pocket, ensuring the precious medicine bottles remained intact. Blackwell noticed the gesture. "What's so important there, boy?" "Medicine, sir, for my mother." Thomas's voice caught. "She's very ill." Something flickered in Blackwell's expression. Recognition, perhaps, or memory. "Consumption?" he asked quietly. Thomas nodded, surprised by the man's perception. Blackwell turned to gaze out the rain-lashed window, his reflection revealing a face suddenly haunted by private grief. "My late wife, Elizabeth," he began, then stopped himself. When he turned back, his businesslike demeanor had returned. "How far is your home, exactly?" 3 miles beyond Harper's Ridge." "And your father?" "Died in the mine collapse 5 years ago." Blackwell's eyebrows rose slightly. "The Coleridge disaster. I remember it. 16 men lost." 17, Thomas corrected quietly. "They never counted Mr. Simmons." The carriage fell silent except for the drum of rain and the occasional rumble of distant thunder. Blackwell studied Thomas with increasing curiosity while Thomas fought the urge to shrink under the scrutiny. "How old are you, Thomas Mason?" 13, sir. "And you're traveling these mountains alone, in a storm with no coat?" Thomas met the man's gaze directly. "My mother needed the medicine more than I needed the coat." Understanding dawned in Blackwell's eyes as he finally comprehended the full meaning behind the boy's half-clothed state. Phillips guided the carriage beneath a rocky overhang where the horses could find relief from the driving rain. The storm had intensified, turning the mountain paths into muddy rivers and bringing darkness hours before sunset. Inside the carriage, an awkward silence stretched between the unlikely pair. Edmund reached for a brass lantern mounted on the carriage wall and lit it with practiced efficiency. The warm glow illuminated the small space, highlighting the stark contrast between its occupants, one draped in fine wool and silk, the other in sodden cotton that clung to his shivering frame. "Here," Edmund said, pulling a woolen travel blanket from beneath his seat. "You'll catch pneumonia in those wet clothes." Thomas accepted the blanket hesitantly, wrapping it around his shoulders. "Thank you, sir. You traded your coat for that medicine?" Edmund gestured toward the bulge in Thomas's pocket. Thomas nodded. "It was my pa's coat. Only thing of value we had left. And you walked to town and back?" "How far?" 12 miles each way, sir." Edmund frowned. The casual courage of the boy's statement struck him as both admirable and disturbing. "All alone?" "Yes, sir." Thomas saw no reason to elaborate. These were simply the facts of his existence. Edmund considered the boy's threadbare appearance with growing discomfort. The carriage lantern cast shadows across Thomas's face, revealing cheekbones too prominent for a child his age. Yet despite his evident poverty, the boy maintained a quiet dignity that Edmund found oddly compelling. "Your mother," Edmund began, choosing his words carefully. "Has she seen a proper doctor?" Thomas shook his head. "Doctors cost money, sir. We make do with what we can gather from the mountain and what the apothecary sells us. And your father left no pension. No compensation from the mining company?" A flicker of bitterness crossed Thomas's face. 3 months' wages and a letter of condolence, sir. The company house went to the next miner. Edmund shifted uneasily. He had reviewed the accounts of several mining operations during his railroad expansion research, including profit margins maintained through minimal worker benefits. The human cost of such practices sat before him now, wrapped in his travel blanket. "And so you live up in these mountains, just you and your mother?" Edmund asked. "Yes, sir. We get by." Thomas straightened his shoulders slightly, a gesture of pride that seemed instinctive. "I can hunt and trap. What teaches me which plants have healing properties. We've managed." The matter-of-fact description of their hard-scrabble existence made Edmund increasingly uncomfortable. He was accustomed to negotiating with businessmen and politicians, not conversing with half-starved mountain children. "The storm shows no sign of abating," Edmund observed, glancing out the window at the sheets of rain. "Your mother will worry." "Yes, sir. That's why I need to continue home, once there's a break in the weather." Edmund studied the boy, noting the determination in his eyes despite his evident exhaustion. He found himself strangely reluctant to let Thomas venture back into the elements alone. "Phillips is familiar with these mountains," Edmund heard himself saying. "Perhaps once the worst passes, we could convey you closer to your home." Thomas looked up in surprise. "That's very kind, sir, but I wouldn't want to inconvenience you." "Nonsense. I have business in Coleridge Junction, but it can wait until this infernal weather clears." "Phillips!" The driver appeared at the carriage window, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "Sir, once conditions permit, we'll be escorting young Mr. Mason to his home beyond Harper's Ridge." "Yes, sir." Phillips nodded, casting a curious glance at Thomas before returning to the horses. Thomas clutched the medicine bottles in his pocket. "I'm grateful, sir, but my mother needs this medicine as soon as possible, and she shall have it," Edmund assured him. "But delivering it with you half dead from exposure would hardly be a comfort to her." The lantern flickered as wind gusted beneath their rocky shelter. Its warm glow caught the polished brass and gleaming wood of the carriage interior, creating a small island of luxury amid the wild mountain storm. "Tell me." "Thomas," Edmund said, more to fill the silence than from genuine curiosity, "what does your mother suffer from exactly?" "The doctor in town called it consumption before we could no longer afford his visits," Thomas replied. "She coughs blood and can't catch her breath. Some days she's too weak to rise from bed." Edmund nodded gravely. "My Elizabeth, my wife, suffered similarly before influenza took her 3 years ago." The admission surprised even Edmund himself. He rarely spoke of Elizabeth, finding the topic too painful for casual conversation. "I'm sorry for your loss." "Sir," Thomas said with a sincerity that sounded too mature for his years. "As I am for yours," Edmund replied automatically, though he found himself meaning it. Another silence fell between them, less awkward than the first. The storm continued its assault on the mountainside, but within the lantern-lit carriage, a fragile connection had formed between two individuals from vastly different worlds. Thomas pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders, his eyelids growing heavy despite his concern for his mother. The warmth and relative safety of the carriage, combined with his exhaustion from the journey, conspired against his determination to remain alert. Edmund watched as the boy fought against fatigue. "Rest while you can," he said, his voice gentler than before. "I'll wake you when we're ready to proceed." Thomas wanted to protest, but found himself nodding instead. His last thought before drifting into an uneasy sleep was of his mother alone in their cabin, waiting for the medicine that might save her life. The storm that trapped Thomas and Edmund beneath the rocky overhang raged with equal fury around the small cabin on the mountainside. Wind found every gap in the rough-hewn logs, whistling through the cracks and sending occasional drafts across Sarah Mason's fever-flushed face. She had been watching the window since midday, counting hours by the movement of shadows. Now darkness came early with the storm, and still no sign of Thomas. Sarah pushed herself upright, ignoring the wave of dizziness that followed. Her fingers found the worn leather Bible that rested beside her bed, John's Bible, given to him by his father, its pages soft from years of calloused fingers, turning them in search of comfort. "Please keep him safe," she whispered, running her palm over the cracked cover. Her prayer encompassed both her son in the present danger and her husband in whatever lay beyond this life. A violent coughing spasm seized her, and Sarah doubled over, pressing a cloth to her mouth. When the fit subsided, she wasn't surprised to see fresh blood staining the fabric. The disease was progressing faster now. She felt it in the increasing weakness of her limbs, the struggle for each breath. The cabin seemed to groan under the storm's assault. A new leak had developed in the far corner, water dripping steadily onto the rough plank floor. Thomas would fix it when he returned, if he returned. Sarah pushed the thought away. Her boy had navigated these mountains since he could walk. He knew every path, every shortcut, every danger, but he'd never before faced such weather without proper clothing. Sarah clutched the Bible tighter, remembering the day John had placed it in her hands. They'd been barely more than children themselves, 17 and 16, standing before the circuit preacher in her parents' home. John, lanky and serious in his father's borrowed suit, had promised to cherish her all his days. The mining company had assigned them a small company house in town, and John's steady work had promised security, if not abundance. For a while, they'd been happy. Thomas came along in their second year of marriage, a strong, healthy baby, with his father's determined chin and her curious eyes. Even when John developed the miner's cough, that first harbinger of what would eventually claim him, they'd faced it together, finding joy in small comforts and each other's company. The mine collapse changed everything. 17 men entered the earth that morning. None returned alive. The company provided the promised 3 months' compensation, then promptly reassigned their house to a new worker brought in from 2 counties over. With nowhere to go and a 7-year-old son to raise, Sarah had retreated to her father-in-law's hunting cabin in the mountains. She turned the Bible over in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of it. The book fell open naturally to John's favorite passage in Psalms. The spine creased from repeated readings. His own father had marked the verses in faded ink, and John had often read them aloud during difficult times. "I will lift up mine eyes unto the hills. From whence cometh my help?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper in the empty cabin, but the familiar words brought a measure of calm. She had taught Thomas to read from these same pages, his small finger tracing each word as he sounded them out by lantern light. Another round of coughing seized her, this one worse than the last. Dark spots danced at the edges of her vision, and Sarah felt herself sliding toward unconsciousness. She fought against it, desperate to remain awake until Thomas returned. "Not yet," she murmured. Though whether she addressed God or her own failing body, she couldn't say. The Bible slipped from her grasp as she fell back against the thin pillow, her breathing shallow and labored. Outside, a branch snapped beneath the storm's force, the crack like a gunshot in the night. Sarah's eyes flew open, momentarily hopeful it was Thomas at the door, but only the wind answered, howling its lonely song around the cabin's eaves. Viva dreams began to take hold as her temperature climbed higher. She saw John standing by the fireplace, smiling that half-smile that had always been reserved just for her. He looked as he had before the mines took their toll, strong and tall, with coal-black hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed. "John!" she whispered. His image wavered like a reflection in disturbed water. Sarah reached toward him, but her hand passed through empty air. "Not yet," John's voice seemed to answer, though she couldn't be sure if it was memory or delirium. "Thomas needs you." Thomas, her son out in the storm. Sarah forced herself back to consciousness through sheer maternal will. The cabin came into focus again, the leaking roof, the dying embers in the fireplace, the empty space where Thomas should be preparing their evening meal. With tremendous effort, Sarah swung her legs over the edge of the bed. The floor felt unsteady beneath her bare feet, the cabin tilting and swaying like a ship at sea. She clutched the bedpost to steady herself, then took one halting step toward the fireplace. Thomas would need warmth when he returned. She made it halfway across the small room before her strength failed. Sarah's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the rough wooden floor, the Bible tumbling from the bed beside her. As consciousness slipped away, her fingers found the worn leather cover once more. "Keep him safe," she whispered into the empty cabin. "Bring my boy home." Outside, the storm raged on, unconcerned with the prayers of a dying woman or the fate of a boy who had sacrificed his last protection to save her. Thomas awoke with a start as the carriage lurched forward. The storm had subsided to a steady rain, and Edmund Blackwell sat across from him, examining papers by lantern light. "We're moving," Thomas said, immediately alert. "How long was I asleep?" "Less than an hour," Edmund replied without looking up. "Phillips believes the worst has passed, and I have a schedule to maintain." Thomas sat upright, clutching the medicine bottles through his pocket. "I need to get home to my mother." "Yes, I recall." Edmund finally set his papers aside. "Phillips knows the way to Harper's Ridge. From there, you can direct us." Thomas blinked in surprise. "You're taking me all the way home?" "It seems the most expedient solution." Edmund checked his pocket watch. "Though it will delay my business considerably." The carriage navigated the treacherous mountain path with surprising agility, Phillips expertly guiding the horses around washouts and fallen branches. Inside, Thomas sat awkwardly across from his unlikely benefactor, the blanket still wrapped tightly around his shoulders. "May I ask what business brings you to these mountains, Mr. Blackwell?" Thomas ventured, uncomfortable with the silence. Edmund considered the boy for a moment. "I represent the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. We're expanding the line through these mountains to connect the coalfields directly to eastern markets." Thomas's expression shifted subtly. "You're buying up land for the railroad?" "Indeed. Progress requires change, young man. These mountains contain resources that could benefit the entire nation." "The mining company says the same thing," Thomas observed quietly. "My pa died bringing out their resources." Edmund frowned, unused to such directness. "I'm sorry for your loss, but you must understand that industrial development creates opportunities. The railroad will bring jobs, commerce, better access to medical care." "For who?" Thomas asked. "The last time a company came here, local folks got mining jobs that killed them, and outsiders got the profits." The bluntness of the statement hung in the air between them. Edmund had encountered opposition to his railroad plans before, but never framed so plainly by a child. "You seem remarkably well informed for a boy with limited schooling," Edmund said, his tone somewhere between impressed and defensive. Thomas shrugged. "I listen when people talk. Read what I can get my hands on." Edmund reached into his leather portfolio and withdrew a folded newspaper. "Perhaps you'd be interested in this. It's 3 days old, but news travels slowly in these parts, I imagine." Thomas accepted the paper eagerly. Reading material was precious in their isolated cabin. As he carefully unfolded the pages, a small photograph slipped out and landed on the carriage floor between them. Edmund bent quickly to retrieve it, but not before Thomas caught sight of the image. A much younger Edmund, standing outside a small, dilapidated shack not unlike many in the mountains. Beside him stood a thin woman and 2 small children, all dressed in clothes that spoke of poverty rather than privilege. "My apologies," Edmund said stiffly, tucking the photograph into his waistcoat pocket. "Personal item." Thomas studied the man with new interest. "That was you? In those clothes?" Edmund's jaw tightened. "A very long time ago. You didn't always have this carriage and fine clothes?" "No." Edmund seemed to debate whether to continue, then sighed. "I grew up in a tenement in Philadelphia. My father worked in a steel mill until the fumes destroyed his lungs. Not unlike your father's fate, I suppose. The admission clearly cost him something." Edmund straightened his already immaculate cuffs, a nervous gesture at odds with his composed demeanor. "How did you get from there to here?" Thomas asked, genuine curiosity replacing his earlier wariness. "Hard work." determination, some fortunate investments. Edmund paused, and help at a critical moment from someone who saw potential in me. Who? A businessman who frequented a tavern where I worked as a boy. He paid for 3 years of education that my family could never have afforded. Edmund's voice softened with the memory. Mr. Harrington. I've not spoken his name aloud in decades. Thomas absorbed this revelation, seeing the wealthy railroad man in a new light. And that made all the difference for you? It opened doors that would have remained firmly closed otherwise. Edmund met Thomas's gaze directly. Opportunity is often just one door away, but someone must open it. The carriage hit a deep rut, jolting them both. Through the window, Thomas recognized familiar terrain. Harper's Ridge is just ahead, he said, leaning forward. Our cabin is about 3 miles beyond, up the old logging trail. Edmund nodded. Phillips will get us as close as possible. As the carriage rounded a bend in the road, the full extent of the storm's damage became visible. Trees lay uprooted across the path, and sections had washed away entirely. Sir, Phillips called down, reining in the horses. The road ahead is impassable by carriage. Thomas was already unwrapping the blanket. I can continue on foot from here. I know every path in this darkness. Edmund frowned. I've done it before. Thomas handed the blanket back to Edmund. Thank you for your kindness, Mr. Blackwell. Edmund studied the boy for a long moment, then made a decision that surprised even himself. Phillips, secure the horses. We'll proceed on foot with young Mr. Mason. Both Thomas and Phillips stared at him in astonishment. Sir? Phillips questioned uncertainly. You heard me. Edmund was already pulling on his heavy overcoat. The boy's mother needs medicine, and I refuse to send a child alone into this wilderness at night. Thomas found his voice. Mr. Blackwell, your fine shoes and clothes are replaceable, Edmund finished firmly. Now, which way? The logging trail had deteriorated into little more than a muddy channel between the trees. Thomas moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had traveled this path countless times in all conditions. Edmund struggled to keep pace, his city shoes slipping on wet stones and sinking into unexpected pockets of mud. Phillips followed a few steps behind, carrying a lantern that cast long, wavering shadows through the dripping forest. The rain had subsided to a gentle patter, but water still dripped heavily from the saturated canopy above. Not much further, Thomas assured them, pausing atop a fallen log to allow the men to catch up. Just beyond that rise, Edmund nodded, too breathless to respond. His expensive wool coat was spattered with mud, his polished shoes ruined beyond salvation. Yet he pressed on, driven by a motivation he couldn't entirely explain to himself. The forest thinned as they climbed, revealing glimpses of the night sky where clouds had begun to part. A sliver of moon provided just enough light to make out the silhouette of a small structure ahead. Little more than a dark shape against the slightly lighter backdrop of the clearing. That's home, Thomas said, his pace quickening. As they drew closer, Edmund saw the cabin for what it was, a crude assemblage of rough-hewn logs with a stone chimney that listed slightly to one side. No smoke rose from it, which seemed to concern Thomas. The fire's out, he muttered, breaking into a run. Edmund and Phillips hurried after him, arriving at the cabin door as Thomas pushed it open. The interior was dark and alarmingly cold. "Ma?" Thomas called, his voice tight with worry. Phillips raised the lantern, its light spilling across the single room. Edmund's breath caught in his throat. After all his years in business, after seeing the working conditions in factories and mines across the country, nothing had prepared him for the stark reality of this mountain poverty. The cabin contained almost nothing. A crude table with 2 mismatched chairs, a few shelves holding the barest essentials, a small iron stove cold with ash, and a narrow bed where... Ma! Thomas rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside a figure crumpled on the floor, near the bed. Sarah Mason lay unconscious, her face flushed with fever, a worn leather Bible clutched in one hand. Thomas gently lifted her thin frame, surprising Edmund with his strength. "Help me get her to bed," Thomas said, his voice steady despite the fear evident in his eyes. Edmund moved forward without hesitation, helping to lift the frail woman onto the thin mattress. Up close, Sarah's condition was even more alarming. Her breathing shallow and labored, her nightdress damp with sweat. "The medicine," Thomas said, pulling the bottles from his pocket with trembling hands. "We need to get her to take it." Edmund took charge with unexpected authority. "Phillips, get that stove lit. We need warmth in here immediately." As Phillips set to work, Edmund turned to Thomas. "What do you need to administer the medicine?" "Water, heated if possible, and she needs to be conscious." Thomas was already wetting a cloth from their water bucket, placing it gently on his mother's forehead. Edmund surveyed the cabin with new eyes. The roof leaked in at least 3 places, with buckets positioned to catch the drips. Wind whistled through gaps in the log walls. The floor was bare wood, worn smooth in paths between the bed, table, and stove. Yet despite the extreme poverty, there were touches that spoke of care. A bunch of dried flowers hanging from a rafter, a carefully mended quilt covering the bed, a shelf containing a few precious books beside the Bible. Sarah stirred slightly at her son's touch, her eyes fluttering open. "Thomas?" Her voice was barely audible. "I'm here, Ma," he replied, relief washing over his face. "I got the medicine." Her gaze wandered past Thomas to the strangers in her home, confusion evident in her fever-bright eyes. "Mrs. Mason," Edmund said, stepping forward and removing his muddied hat. "Edmund Blackwell at your service. Your son and I encountered each other on the trail. The storm was quite severe." Sarah's eyes widened slightly at his formal speech and fine clothes, incongruous in their humble cabin. Phillips had managed to coax the stove to life, and flames were beginning to lick at fresh kindling. Warmth slowly returned to the small space as Thomas carefully measured the medicine into a spoon. "This will help your cough, Ma," he said, supporting her head as she swallowed the dark liquid. Edmund watched the interaction with a strange tightness in his chest. He thought of Elizabeth in her final days, attended by 3 physicians and a team of nurses in their Boston mansion, surrounded by every comfort money could provide. Yet death had claimed her just the same. "Mr. Blackwell," Thomas said, interrupting his thoughts, "could you hand me that other bottle?" "The small one?" Edmund retrieved the vial, reading the handwritten label. "For fever. 3 drops only." As Thomas administered the second medicine, Sarah's gaze fixed on Edmund. Despite her weakened state, her eyes held a mother's protective scrutiny. "Your son showed remarkable courage today," Edmund told her. "He's quite an extraordinary young man." A ghost of a smile touched Sarah's cracked lips. "He's his father's son." Thomas tucked the quilt around her shoulders. "Rest now, Ma. I'll heat some broth." Phillips approached Edmund, speaking quietly. "The storm has passed, sir. We should consider our departure if you're to make your appointment." Edmund glanced at his pocket watch. He was already hours behind schedule. The mining executives would be impatiently awaiting his arrival, and the delay would weaken his negotiating position. Yet as he stood in the doorway of this desperate cabin, watching Thomas move about with adult responsibility far beyond his years, Edmund found his carefully ordered priorities shifting beneath his feet. "You should be on your way." "Mr. Blackwell," Thomas said quietly, as he stirred a pot of thin broth on the now glowing stove. "I can manage from here." Edmund sat on one of the mismatched wooden chairs, his fine clothes incongruous against the rough-hewn furniture. Phillips had returned to the carriage to secure it for the night, leaving the railroad magnate alone with Thomas and his sleeping mother. "Your appointment," Thomas added. The mining executives, Edmund's eyebrows rose slightly. "You were listening quite carefully during our carriage conversation. Information is valuable when you have little else," Thomas replied with a shrug. He poured a small portion of broth into a chipped cup. Testing its temperature with a careful finger, Edmund watched the boy move about the cabin with practiced efficiency. His actions, those of someone long accustomed to being the caretaker rather than the cared for. There was something both admirable and profoundly sad about the boy's self-sufficiency. "The meeting can wait," Edmund said finally. "The storm has likely delayed them as well." Thomas glanced at him skeptically as he knelt beside his mother, gently rousing her to take some broth. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, and she accepted a few sips before drifting back to sleep, her breathing less labored than before. "The medicine seems to be helping," Edmund observed. Thomas nodded, relief evident in his face. "Her color's better already." The boy returned to the stove, stirring the remaining broth before offering a cup to Edmund. "It's not much, but you're welcome to share what we have." The simple hospitality, offered from such profound scarcity, caught Edmund off guard. "Thank you," he said, accepting the cup with genuine gratitude. The broth was little more than hot water, with a few wild onions, and what might have been dried meat, but Edmund sipped it as if it were fine soup at his club in Boston. Silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional pop from the stove and Sarah's steady breathing. Thomas took the second chair, his eyes constantly returning to his mother, monitoring her rest. "May I ask you something, Mr. Blackwell?" Thomas finally said, his young voice solemn in the dimly lit cabin. "Of course. That photograph in your pocket, the one of you as a boy. Who were the others?" "Your family?" Edmund set down his cup, surprised by the directness of the question. Few people in his current life knew anything of his origins, and none would dare to inquire. "Yes," he answered after a pause. "My mother and younger siblings. That picture was taken shortly after my father died. I was about your age." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "And now you buy mountains for railroads." "I create connections," Edmund corrected gently. "Railroads connect people to markets, to medical care, to education, to opportunity. But the people who already live on the land you need, what happens to them?" The question hung in the air, direct and unvarnished in the way only a child could phrase it. Edmund shifted in the uncomfortable chair, feeling its uneven legs wobble beneath him. "They're compensated for their property," he said. "Fairly, I might add. Is money always fair payment for a home?" Thomas asked, gesturing around the humble cabin. "This was my grandfather's hunting shelter. My father played here as a boy. I was born in that bed. What's the fair price for that?" Edmund had negotiated with senators, industrialists, and foreign dignitaries, yet found himself momentarily speechless before this child's simple wisdom. "Progress requires difficult choices sometimes," he finally managed. "Whose progress?" Thomas asked quietly. The stove crackled in the silence that followed. Edmund studied the boy's face in the golden light, the determined set of his jaw, the intelligence in his eyes, the premature lines of worry across his forehead. "You're quite the philosopher." "Thomas Mason," Edmund said with a small smile. Thomas shrugged. "Just asking questions that matter to folks like us." "Indeed." Edmund leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "When I was your age, after my father died, I worked 14 hours a day at a tavern near the docks. The owner let me sleep in the storage room and gave me one meal daily. I sent every penny home to my mother and siblings." Thomas's eyes widened slightly. "How did you get from there to here?" Edmund's fingers absently traced the outline of the pocket watch in his waistcoat. "A regular customer at the tavern, a businessman named Harrington, noticed I could calculate complex tabs in my head faster than he could with pencil and paper. He arranged for me to attend school in the mornings before my shift, just like that." "A stranger helped you?" "Not entirely from charity," Edmund admitted. "He invested in potential. 3 years later, I began working as his clerk. 5 years after that, I managed one of his businesses. When he died, I had enough knowledge and capital to begin acquiring my own ventures." Thomas considered this, his gaze returning to his sleeping mother. "So someone opened a door for you?" "Precisely," Edmund nodded, struck by the boy's perception. "As I mentioned in the carriage, and without that open door?" The question was simple but profound. Edmund looked around the cabin, seeing it with new eyes, not as merely poor, but as constrained by circumstances beyond its occupant's control. "I likely would have remained at the tavern until my body gave out," Edmund admitted, "or found work in the same factories that killed my father." Thomas nodded, processing this honesty. "Thank you for helping us get home tonight. Mr. Blackwell, for someone from your world, it was a kindness you didn't have to show." The statement, offered without flattery or guile, struck Edmund more deeply than any formal expression of gratitude ever had. This child saw the world with remarkable clarity, "You should rest, Thomas," Edmund said gently. "I'll watch over your mother for a while." Thomas hesitated. "The habit of responsibility not easily surrendered. I promise I'll wake you if there's any change," Edmund assured him. The boy finally nodded, exhaustion evident in the slump of his shoulders. He settled onto a thin pallet near his mother's bed, pulling a threadbare blanket over himself. Edmund sat back in the wooden chair, keeping vigil as promised, listening to the soft breathing of mother and son. Outside, the storm had passed, and stars emerged in the clearing sky. Somewhere in the darkness, business associates waited impatiently for a meeting that suddenly seemed far less important than it had that morning. Morning arrived with shafts of golden light filtering through the cabin's single window. Edmund awoke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings. His back ached from sleeping upright in the wooden chair, and his fine clothes were hopelessly creased. Thomas was already awake, moving quietly around the cabin. He had rekindled the stove and was heating water in a dented kettle. Outside, birds called to one another in the clear post-storm air. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwell," Thomas said softly, noticing Edmund stirring. Edmund nodded, running a hand over his beard. "Your mother?" "Better," Thomas replied, glancing toward the bed where Sarah still slept. Her fever broke around dawn. "The medicine is working." "Excellent news," Edmund said, rising stiffly from the chair. Phillips appeared in the doorway, knocking gently on the frame. "Sir, I've checked the road. It should be passable now, though difficult in places." Edmund nodded, extracting his pocket watch. The meeting at Coleridge Junction had been scheduled for 7 o'clock the previous evening. By now, the mining executives would have either departed or lodged complaints with his Boston office about his unexplained absence. Strangely, Edmund found he cared less about this professional discourtesy than he would have expected. His gaze traveled around the cabin, taking in the threadbare furnishings, the patched roof, the carefully mended clothing hanging from pegs on the wall. The poverty was evident, yet there was also a quiet dignity in how the small family managed with so little. An idea began to form in Edmund's mind, one that surprised him with its clarity and insistence. He removed his portfolio from inside his coat, withdrawing several sheets of crisp paper and a fountain pen. "Thomas," he said, seating himself at the rough table, "might I trouble you for some of that hot water for tea? I find I think more clearly with tea." Thomas looked surprised, but nodded, preparing a battered tin cup with the last of their tea leaves. As he placed it before Edmund, Sarah stirred, her eyes opening. "Thomas?" she called, her voice stronger than the previous night. The boy was instantly at her side. "I'm here, Ma. How do you feel?" "Better," she said, attempting to sit up. Her gaze fell on Edmund and confusion crossed her face. "The gentleman from last night, it wasn't a fever dream then?" Edmund rose and approached the bed, offering a formal bow. "Edmund Blackwell, Mrs. Mason. Your son and I encountered each other during yesterday's storm." Sarah managed a weak smile. "Thomas has a habit of finding help when it's most needed. Thank you for bringing him home safely." "It was my honor," Edmund replied, surprised to find he meant it sincerely. With Thomas's help, Sarah moved to sit at the table, wrapped in the patchwork quilt. Some color had returned to her cheeks, though she remained alarmingly thin. Edmund cleared his throat, unaccustomed to uncertainty. "Mrs. Mason, Thomas, I have a proposition I'd like to discuss with you." Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances. "I mentioned to Thomas that I represent the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. We're expanding our line through these mountains to connect the coal fields with eastern markets." Sarah's expression grew wary. "Are you here to buy our land, Mr. Blackwell?" "Initially, yes. That was my purpose in the region," Edmund admitted. "However, my journey has taken an unexpected turn." He spread a map on the table, pointing to a section of mountain terrain. "Your property sits here, correct?" Thomas nodded, leaning forward to study the map. "The planned rail line would pass approximately 2 miles south," Edmund continued, tracing the route with his finger. "The company has already secured most of the necessary rights of way." "Then you don't need our land?" Sarah asked, a note of relief in her voice. "Not for the railroad itself, no," Edmund confirmed. "But I've been contemplating personal investment in the region. He withdrew a blank sheet from his portfolio and began to write, the fountain pen scratching softly against the paper. What I'm proposing is this. I would like to purchase 50 acres surrounding your cabin, including the southern slope and creek. Sarah's face fell. Mr. Blackwell, this has been Mason land for... Edmund raised a hand gently. Please allow me to finish. I would purchase the land, but with specific conditions. He continued writing as he spoke. First, you and Thomas would retain lifetime rights to live in and improve your current home. Second, I would establish a business enterprise on the property, a medicinal herb farm and processing facility. Thomas's eyes widened. Medicinal herbs. Yes. During our conversation last night, you mentioned your mother's knowledge of local plants with healing properties. Such knowledge is valuable, particularly with a railroad soon to provide transportation to urban markets. Sarah looked bewildered. You want to sell mountain herbs to city folk? Precisely, Edmund said, warming to his subject. Traditional remedies are increasingly sought after, even as modern medicine advances. The combination of your knowledge and my business connections could prove quite profitable. He finished writing and slid the paper across the table. This is merely a preliminary outline, but it specifies an immediate payment for the land, along with a 20% share of the business for you and Thomas. Sarah stared at the figure Edmund had written. It was more money than she had seen in her lifetime. Why would you do this? She asked, suspicion evident in her voice. You're a wealthy man. What do you gain by helping us? Edmund considered her question carefully. In truth, Mrs. Mason, I'm not entirely certain myself. Perhaps I see something of my own past in your situation. Perhaps I'm simply following an instinct about a promising business opportunity. He paused. Or perhaps your son has reminded me of certain obligations I once benefited from myself. Thomas picked up the paper, reading it slowly. This would mean changes for us, Ma? Indeed it would, Edmund acknowledged. But I believe they would be changes for the better. Sarah studied Edmund's face with the careful scrutiny of someone who had learned the hard way to distrust easy solutions. This land has been in my husband's family for generations, Mr. Blackwell. It's not just property, it's our history, our home. I understand, Edmund said quietly. And that's why I'm not proposing to take it from you, but rather to invest in its future and yours. The contract sat between them on the rough wooden table, its crisp white paper stark against the weathered surface. Outside, Phillips waited patiently by the carriage, unaware of the life-changing conversation taking place within the humble cabin. Sarah set the contract aside, neither accepting nor rejecting it outright. Before we discuss this further, Mr. Blackwell, I'd like to show you something. She turned to Thomas. Fetch my gathering basket. Thomas retrieved a shallow woven basket from beside the door, while Sarah wrapped the quilt more securely around her shoulders. Though still weak, determination animated her movements. If you're proposing a business based on mountain medicine, you should understand what that truly means, she said, rising slowly from her chair. Can you walk a short distance? Edmund nodded, curious. Of course. With Thomas supporting his mother on one side and Edmund cautiously offering his arm on the other, the trio stepped outside into the bright morning. The storm had washed the world clean, leaving the mountain air crisp and fragrant. Despite her illness, Sarah moved with the confidence of someone navigating familiar territory, leading them along a narrow path that wound behind the cabin. The mountains provide everything we need. If you know where to look, Sarah explained as they walked. My grandmother taught my mother, who taught me, and I've taught Thomas. Knowledge passed down through generations. She stopped at a small clearing where various plants grew in seemingly haphazard patterns. Edmund realized with surprise that this was a garden of sorts, though unlike any formal garden he'd seen in Boston. Sarah knelt slowly, her fingers gently touching a plant with delicate white flowers. Bloodroot, she said. The sap treats respiratory ailments and skin conditions. She moved to another plant. Wild ginger for stomach problems. Jewelweed there for treating rashes and poison ivy. Edmund watched, fascinated, as Sarah identified plant after plant, explaining their properties and preparations with the confidence of a university professor. Her knowledge was comprehensive and specific: which parts to use, when to harvest, how to prepare each remedy. "Most city doctors dismiss our ways as superstition," Sarah said, carefully placing a sprig of each plant into her basket. "But these medicines kept our people alive for generations before doctors ever came to these mountains. And this knowledge, you've documented it?" Edmund asked, his business mind already cataloguing possibilities. Sarah smiled. "Not on paper, Mr. Blackwell, in memory and practice." She tapped her temple. "Up here and in Thomas's mind as well. He has a gift for remembering." Thomas demonstrated by reciting the properties of each plant his mother had pointed out, adding details about growing conditions and harvesting times that Sarah hadn't mentioned. "Impressive," Edmund acknowledged. "Though for a business, we would need to create written formulas, consistent preparations." "That could be arranged," Sarah conceded. "But there's something you should understand about mountain medicine." Her expression grew serious. "It's not just about the plants themselves. It's about respect for what they provide. We never take more than we need, always leave enough for regrowth, and give thanks for the bounty." Edmund suppressed a smile at what sounded like superstition, but Sarah caught his expression. "You find that quaint, perhaps," she said without rancor. "But consider this. The mining company stripped entire mountainsides bare in their hunger for coal. Now those slopes wash away with every rain, poisoning streams below. The forest here remains healthy because we harvest with care." Edmund found himself chastened by her quiet wisdom. "A fair point, Mrs. Mason." They continued walking slowly, Sarah pointing out more plants along the way, some so common Edmund would have considered them weeds, others so rare he would never have noticed them among the forest undergrowth. "Yellow root tea for sore throats," Sarah indicated a low plant with small yellow flowers. "My husband drank it daily when the mine dust affected his breathing." "Did it help?" Edmund asked. "For a time," Sarah said quietly, "until the damage became too severe." They reached a small stream, its waters running clear and swift after the storm. Sarah settled on a moss-covered rock to rest, her brief expedition having taxed her limited strength. "The water here feeds our herb patches," Thomas explained. "Ma says it has special properties because it filters through limestone upstream." Edmund crouched to examine the stream more closely, dipping his fingers in the cool water. His railroad had rerouted countless waterways during construction, never considering their importance beyond engineering challenges to be overcome. "Mr. Blackwell," Sarah said, watching him thoughtfully, "your proposal is generous, but I wonder if you truly understand what you'd be purchasing. This land isn't just dirt and trees to be bought and sold. It's knowledge, history, and a way of life." Edmund stood, wiping his hand on his handkerchief. "I'm beginning to understand that, Mrs. Mason." "And your business plan," she continued. "Would it preserve these plants for future generations, or exploit them until nothing remains?" The directness of her question caught Edmund off guard. In 3 decades of business negotiations, no one had dared question his intentions so plainly. "I hadn't considered that aspect," he admitted. "My focus was on profit potential." "Then perhaps your contract needs revision," Sarah suggested. "If we were to consider such an arrangement, it would need to respect the balance that's kept these mountains healing people for centuries." Thomas watched this exchange with keen interest, his young mind absorbing the negotiation strategies of both his mother and the wealthy businessman. "What would you propose instead?" Edmund asked, genuinely curious. Sarah gestured to the surrounding forest. "A business that harvests sustainably, that replants what it takes, that treats these remedies as precious gifts rather than commodities, and that keeps the knowledge alive rather than reducing it to formulas on a shelf." Edmund considered her words. The business opportunity remained compelling, but Sarah had introduced considerations he would never have contemplated. There was wisdom in her approach that went beyond mere sentiment, a long-term vision that his quarterly profit mindset hadn't encompassed. "You've given me much to think about, Mrs. Mason," he said finally. Perhaps I should redraft my proposal with these principles in mind. Sarah nodded, satisfied that she had made her point. As Thomas helped her to her feet, Edmund found himself seeing the mountain landscape with new eyes, not as property to be acquired, but as a complex living system that had sustained generations through hardship and prosperity alike. The simple herb garden, so easily overlooked, suddenly seemed as valuable as any coal seam or timber stand, perhaps more so for its renewable nature and the ancient knowledge it represented. 2 days later, Edmund's carriage rolled down the main street of Coleridge, drawing curious stares from townspeople unaccustomed to such finery. Beside him sat Thomas, wearing a clean shirt borrowed from Philip's and looking both excited and apprehensive. "Are you certain your mother will be all right alone?" Edmund asked, noticing the boy's frequent glances backward toward the mountains. "Mrs. Hollister from the next hollow is staying with her," Thomas assured him. "And the medicine is working well." "Ma insisted I come." Edmund nodded, consulting his notebook where he'd spent the previous evening making extensive notes about the medicinal plants Sarah had shown him. The pages contained sketches, properties, and potential markets for each remedy, along with a revised business plan that incorporated Sarah's wisdom about sustainable harvesting. "The apothecary first," Edmund decided as Phillips brought the carriage to a halt outside the general store. "Then I have some business associates to meet." Thomas followed Edmund into Mr. Simmons' shop, the bell announcing their arrival just as it had when Thomas had traded his father's coat for medicine. The apothecary looked up from his work, recognition flashing across his face. "Young Mason," he acknowledged, then paused when he noticed Thomas's companion. "And you are?" "Edmund Blackwell, sir." Edmund extended his hand. "I understand you provided medication for Mrs. Mason recently." "I wanted to thank you personally for your assistance." Simmons hesitantly shook the offered hand, clearly confused by the wealthy stranger's interest in the widow and her son. "Just doing my business, sir." "Nevertheless," Edmund continued, "your generosity in accepting the boy's coat as payment when cash was unavailable shows admirable character." The apothecary shifted uncomfortably. "The coat was fair value for the medicine." "Indeed." Edmund surveyed the shelves of remedies and supplies. "I understand you're familiar with local medicinal plants, as well as pharmaceutical preparations." "I've been serving this community 30 years, Simmons confirmed cautiously. "Know every remedy these mountains provide, though most folks these days prefer the modern medicines when they can afford them." "Fascinating." Edmund removed his notebook. "I'd be interested in discussing the market. Potential for traditional remedies. Mrs. Mason has shared some remarkable knowledge that I believe could be developed into a profitable enterprise." Simmons' eyebrows rose. "Sarah Mason knows more about mountain cures than anyone living. Her grandmother was a renowned healer in these parts." He glanced curiously at Thomas. "You planning some business venture, Mr. Blackwell?" "I am," Edmund confirmed. "And I'd value your professional opinion on several aspects." He opened his notebook, revealing detailed notes and calculations. "Perhaps we could meet later today to discuss distribution possibilities." The apothecary's expression shifted from skepticism to cautious interest as he examined Edmund's notes. "I might be available this afternoon." "Excellent. 3 o'clock?" At Simmons' nod, Edmund continued. "In the meantime, I'd like to repurchase Mr. Mason's coat, if you still have it." Simmons hesitated, then moved to a cabinet behind the counter. "Haven't had occasion to sell it yet," he admitted. Retrieving the folded garment, Edmund placed several bills on the counter, far more than the coat was worth. "For your trouble, Mr. Simmons." Outside, Edmund handed the coat to Thomas, whose eyes widened in disbelief. "Pa's coat," he whispered, clutching the familiar fabric. "It seemed appropriate to recover it," Edmund said simply. "Now, we have another appointment at the bank." Thomas followed Edmund into Coleridge's small bank, acutely aware of how out of place he appeared despite the borrowed shirt. The bank manager, recognizing Edmund immediately, ushered them into his office with effusive greetings. "Mr. Blackwell, we'd heard you were delayed by the storm. The mining executives were most disappointed to miss their meeting with you." Unavoidable circumstances, Edmund replied smoothly. I've rescheduled for later this week. However, I'm here today on a different matter. He gestured to Thomas. May I introduce Thomas Mason? He and his mother are local residents with whom I'm establishing a business arrangement. The manager's smile faltered slightly as he took in Thomas's humble appearance. I see. How may I assist you today, Mr. Blackwell? I need to establish an account in Mrs. Sarah Mason's name, with Thomas authorized to make withdrawals with proper documentation. Edmund removed an envelope from his portfolio. This draft represents the initial investment. The manager's eyes widened when he saw the amount. This is most irregular, Mr. Blackwell. The boy is clearly underage, and the boy, Edmund interrupted firmly, is a business partner and should be treated with appropriate respect. If you find these arrangements too challenging, I'm certain the bank in Westridge would accommodate us. The threat of losing Blackwell's business worked immediately. Of course, sir. We can make special arrangements. I merely wanted to ensure everything was properly handled. Thomas watched this exchange with fascination, observing how Edmund's wealth and status allowed him to override objections that would have been insurmountable for a mountain family on their own. As they left the bank, account book in hand, Thomas noticed the stares of townspeople who had previously ignored or pitied him. Now, walking alongside Edmund Blackwell, he had suddenly become visible. They look at me differently, he observed quietly. Edmund glanced around, noting the curious gazes. People respect money and power, Thomas. It's a simple fact of human nature. But I'm the same person I was yesterday, Edmund smiled slightly. An important insight, and one I hope you'll remember when your circumstances improve. They continued down the street toward the hotel where Edmund had arranged to meet with several business contacts. Outside the establishment, a group of well-dressed men, engaged in conversation, fell silent as Edmund approached. Blackwell, one acknowledged stiffly. We waited 2 hours for you at Coleridge Junction. My apologies, gentlemen, Edmund replied without elaboration. Unavoidable circumstances. We'll reschedule at your convenience. The man's gaze shifted to Thomas. And who's this? Your new valet? Thomas stiffened, but Edmund placed a steady hand on his shoulder. This is Mr. Thomas Mason, a business associate whose knowledge of local botanicals surpasses anyone I've encountered in Boston's scientific circles. The deliberate elevation of Thomas's status wasn't lost on anyone present. The men exchanged glances, recalibrating their assessment of the mountain boy in light of Edmund's endorsement. Interesting, the spokesman said without conviction. Well, we'll await word on rescheduling our meeting. With curt nods, the group moved away. Associates, not friends, Edmund explained to Thomas as they entered the hotel. Remember that distinction in business. Thomas nodded, absorbing another lesson from the world he was suddenly entering. Mr. Blackwell, why are you doing all this for us? Edmund paused, considering the question carefully. Let's just say I'm opening a door, Thomas. What you and your mother make of the opportunity will be entirely your own achievement. Sarah sat propped against her pillows, watching with a mixture of amusement and apprehension as Dr. Harrison unpacked his medical bag on the cabin's small table. The physician had arrived with Edmund and Thomas an hour earlier, making the journey from town in Edmund's carriage. His presence in their humble home felt as incongruous as Edmund's had initially. Mrs. Mason, the doctor said, approaching her bedside with his stethoscope. I understand you've been suffering from consumption for some time now. That's what they called it when I could still afford the town doctor, Sarah confirmed. Been managing with mountain remedies since, Dr. Harrison nodded without judgment. May I examine you? As the doctor conducted his examination, Thomas and Edmund waited outside, giving Sarah privacy. The mountain air was crisp, and Thomas pointed out various plants visible from the cabin clearing. Continuing Edmund's education in mountain botany, Ma says that red one only grows where lightning has struck, Thomas explained, indicating a distinctive plant at the forest's edge. It draws the fire from burns if you mash the leaves into a poultice. Edmund made another notation in his ever-present notebook. Fascinating. The potential applications for these remedies extend far beyond these mountains. Thomas. Inside, Dr. Harrison listened intently to Sarah's breathing, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite the concerning sounds he detected. He checked her pulse, examined her throat, and noted the pallor of her skin. "How long have you been coughing blood, Mrs. Mason?" he asked gently. "Started about a year ago," Sarah admitted. "Gets worse in the damp weather." The doctor nodded, making notes in a small leather-bound journal. "And this medicine from the apothecary, it's provided some relief?" "More than I expected," Sarah acknowledged. "I can breathe easier since taking it." Dr. Harrison completed his examination and returned to the table, organizing several bottles and packets from his bag. "Mrs. Mason, I won't deceive you. Your condition is serious. The tuberculosis, what you call consumption, has progressed significantly." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. "Am I dying, doctor? I need the plain truth for Thomas's sake." The doctor considered her question with the respect it deserved. "Without intervention, yes, eventually. But I believe we can arrest the disease's progression with proper treatment." He laid out 3 different medications on the table. "This is a modern regimen that has shown considerable success in cases like yours. One for the infection itself, one to ease breathing, and one to build strength. Combined with proper nutrition and rest, we have reason for cautious optimism. And the cost?" Sarah asked practically. "Mr. Blackwell has arranged payment," Dr. Harrison replied. "My understanding is that it's an advance against your future business partnership." Sarah's expression registered surprise, followed by quiet dignity. "That's generous of him. He seems quite invested in your recovery," the doctor observed. "Something about valuable knowledge that shouldn't be lost." Sarah smiled slightly. "Mountain wisdom has its worth, it seems." Dr. Harrison packed up his bag, leaving the medications with clear instructions. "I'll return in 2 weeks to assess your progress. Meanwhile, follow the regimen precisely, and continue with any traditional remedies that provide comfort. They may complement the medical treatment." As the doctor stepped outside, Edmund approached him immediately. "Well?" "Tuberculosis as expected," Dr. Harrison confirmed quietly, out of Thomas's earshot. "Advanced, but not beyond hope. The medications I've provided should help, though recovery will be slow. But she can recover." Edmund pressed. "With proper care, nutrition and medication, possibly. Her constitution seems remarkably strong, despite the disease's progression." The doctor glanced back at the cabin. "She's survived this long with minimal treatment, which speaks to her resilience." Edmund nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, doctor. I'd like you to make regular visits, weekly rather than fortnightly." "Whatever she needs." "Of course, Mr. Blackwell." The doctor hesitated. "May I ask your interest in this family?" "It seems rather personal for a business matter." Edmund's expression revealed nothing. "Let's just say I recognize value when I see it." "Doctor, Mrs. Mason's knowledge represents generations of practical medicine that might otherwise be lost." Thomas approached from where he'd been collecting kindling. "Is Ma going to be all right?" he asked directly, his young face serious. Dr. Harrison looked to Edmund, who nodded slightly, encouraging honesty. "Your mother is very ill, Thomas," the doctor said gently. "But with these new medications and continued care, she has a fighting chance. Much depends on proper nutrition, rest, and avoiding damp conditions." Thomas absorbed this information with the grave maturity Edmund had come to expect from him. "This cabin leaks when it rains heavy. Not good for her lungs." "Indeed not," Dr. Harrison agreed. "I've been considering that issue," Edmund interjected. "Proper housing would significantly improve your mother's prognosis, I imagine, Doctor." "Undoubtedly," Harrison confirmed. "Dry, warm quarters are essential for recovery from tuberculosis." Edmund turned to Thomas. "I have some ideas about improvements to your home that might address these concerns. Would you and your mother be amenable to such changes?" Thomas looked uncertain. "Ma's proud, sir. Doesn't like charity." "This wouldn't be charity, Thomas," Edmund clarified. "Rather an investment in our business partnership. Your mother's knowledge is the foundation of our venture, so her health is a business priority." The boy considered this explanation carefully, recognizing the logic while also appreciating the way Edmund had framed the assistance to preserve his mother's dignity. "I think she might accept it that way," Thomas agreed. As Dr. Harrison departed with promises to return the following week, Edmund remained at the cabin, making detailed notes and measurements. He sketched a rough floor plan, expanding the existing structure while maintaining its essential character. "What are you drawing, Mr. Blackwell?" Thomas asked, peering over his shoulder. "Improvements," Edmund explained, showing Thomas the sketch. "A proper bedroom for your mother, with windows for fresh air and sunshine. A larger main room. A sturdy roof that doesn't leak. All constructed around your existing cabin to minimize disruption during your mother's recovery." Thomas studied the drawing with interest. "You can do that?" "With the right craftsman, certainly." Edmund made another notation. "I have contacts among the railroad construction teams, men skilled in building solid structures in challenging terrain." Inside the cabin, Sarah watched through the window as Thomas and Edmund bent over the notebook, deep in conversation. The doctor's visit had confirmed what she had long suspected about her condition, but had also offered something she hadn't expected: hope. She held the stethoscope the doctor had left behind for Thomas to monitor her breathing between visits. The cool metal instrument seemed to bridge two worlds: her traditional knowledge of healing plants and the modern medicine that might save her life. Perhaps there was wisdom in both approaches, Sarah reflected, just as there might be value in the partnership Edmund Blackwell was proposing. A week after the doctor's visit, Edmund returned to the cabin with a leather portfolio containing architectural drawings. Sarah, showing small but significant improvements from the medical treatment, sat at the table while Thomas stoked the fire. Outside, the first hints of spring were transforming the mountainside, with delicate green shoots pushing through the soil in Sarah's herb garden. "Mrs. Mason, Thomas," Edmund greeted them formally. "I've finalized the proposal we've been discussing." He spread the drawings on the table, detailed, professional renderings done by an architect from Charleston who had traveled to Coleridge at Edmund's request. Sarah studied the plans with careful attention. The drawing showed a substantial two-story home, built around and incorporating their existing cabin. The original structure would become a central hearthroom, preserved intact but reinforced, with new construction extending from it like branches from a tree trunk. "This is far more than we discussed, Mr. Blackwell," Sarah observed, tracing the lines with her finger. "The scope expanded somewhat during the design process," Edmund admitted. "But I believe each element serves a practical purpose." He pointed to various features on the drawing. "Here, a proper bedroom for you with large windows facing south for maximum sunlight, essential for your recovery, according to Dr. Harrison. A study for Thomas with built-in bookshelves. A modern kitchen with indoor pump. And most importantly, this wing would serve as a workshop for preparing and packaging the herbal remedies." Thomas leaned over his mother's shoulder, eyes wide with wonder at the transformation proposed for their humble home. "And this?" Sarah asked, indicating a large room at the rear of the structure. "A greenhouse," Edmund explained, his enthusiasm evident, "for cultivating certain species year-round, experimenting with growing conditions, and ensuring continuous production regardless of season." He withdrew additional papers from his portfolio, detailed business projections, marketing strategies, and distribution plans. "I've consulted with apothecaries in 3 states. There's considerable interest in authenticated Appalachian remedies, particularly with the railroad providing reliable transportation to urban markets." Sarah set the drawings aside and fixed Edmund with a direct gaze. "This represents a substantial investment, Mr. Blackwell, far beyond our initial discussions." Edmund nodded, acknowledging her perception. "The potential exceeds my original estimates. Your knowledge, combined with modern business practices and distribution networks, presents an opportunity I'd be foolish to approach half-heartedly." "And our role in this enterprise?" Sarah asked cautiously. Edmund produced another document. As discussed, 20% ownership for you and Thomas, with you serving as chief formulator and Thomas as assistant manager, learning both the remedies and the business aspects. He paused. With provisions for his education as well. Thomas looked up sharply. Education? A tutor initially, Edmund explained. Then preparatory school when you're ready, if you wish. Perhaps university eventually. Seeing Thomas's stunned expression, he added, Knowledge is the most valuable asset in any enterprise, Thomas. Your mother's traditional wisdom combined with formal education could be extraordinarily powerful. Sarah studied Edmund's face, searching for the catch, the hidden motivation behind such generosity. You're proposing to change our lives entirely, Mr. Blackwell. I must understand why. Edmund considered his response carefully. 20 years ago, Mrs. Mason, I made my first significant investment, a small shipping venture that eventually grew into a profitable enterprise. I recognized untapped potential and had the means to develop it. He gestured to the architectural drawings. I see similar potential here. The business aspect is sound, I assure you, but there's more to it, Sarah pressed gently. This feels personal for you. Edmund was silent for a moment. Perhaps it is, he finally admitted. Thomas reminded me of myself at his age, determined, intelligent, constrained by circumstances rather than capability. And your situation, he hesitated. My wife Elizabeth died of respiratory failure despite having access to the finest physicians in Boston. The unfairness of that still haunts me. The simple honesty of his admission hung in the cabin's quiet air. We don't want charity. Mr. Blackwell, Thomas said, echoing his mother's oft-stated principle. This isn't charity, Edmund replied firmly. It's investment in business, yes, but also in potential. The man who helped me, Mr. Harrington, didn't give handouts. He created opportunities and expected excellence in return. I'm proposing the same arrangement. Sarah gathered the architectural drawings, aligning them carefully. These changes, they would happen around us while we continue living here? Edmund nodded. The construction team would build the new sections first, allowing you to remain in place until the additions are habitable. Then they would reinforce and integrate the original cabin. Minimal disruption to your daily life and recovery. And if the business fails, Sarah asked practically, the deed will be structured to ensure the home remains yours regardless of the venture's success, Edmund assured her. I'm confident in our prospects, but I wouldn't risk your security on commercial fortunes. Sarah exchanged a long look with Thomas. A silent communication between mother and son that Edmund couldn't interpret. We need time to consider, she finally said. This is no small decision. Of course, Edmund returned the documents to his portfolio. Take whatever time you need. My offer remains open. As he prepared to depart, Thomas walked with him to the waiting carriage. Mr. Blackwell, the boy said hesitantly, the education you mentioned, would I still learn the mountain ways too? The plants and remedies? Edmund placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. That knowledge is the foundation of everything I'm proposing. Modern education wouldn't replace it, but complement it. The most powerful position is at the intersection of both worlds, something I suspect you already understand intuitively. Thomas nodded, his young face serious as he considered this vision of his future, so vastly different from anything he had imagined possible before Edmund's carriage had stopped on the mountain path that stormy day. Inside the cabin, Sarah studied the architectural drawing that Edmund had left behind at her request. Her fingers traced the careful integration of their existing home into the larger structure, a metaphor, perhaps, for what Edmund was proposing for their lives. Not erasure of the past, but building upon it, preserving what mattered while creating new possibilities. Summer arrived in the mountains, bringing warm breezes and abundant growth to Sarah's expanding herb garden. 3 months had passed since Edmund's proposal, and the transformation of the Mason homestead was well underway. The original cabin remained at the heart of the structure, now surrounded by the framework of new rooms that would soon provide the family with comforts they had never imagined. Thomas stood at the edge of the construction site, watching the workers raise a roof beam for the greenhouse. He wore a new coat, not his father's old one, which now hung reverently preserved in his bedroom, but one Edmund had commissioned specifically for him. Made of quality wool, with a lining that could be removed in warmer weather, it was practical rather than ostentatious, respecting the boy's character while providing the protection he needed. "Impressive progress," Edmund remarked, joining Thomas at his observation point. He had taken to visiting the mountain property weekly, overseeing construction while continuing his education in traditional remedies. "From Sarah, Mr. Peterson says they'll have the roof completed before the first autumn rains," Thomas replied, referring to the construction foreman. "The greenhouse glass arrives next week." Edmund nodded approvingly. "And how are your studies progressing?" Thomas brightened. "Mr. Collins assigned me the Count of Monte Cristo yesterday. It's much more exciting than the grammar. Exercises. The tutor Edmund had hired, a young university graduate with progressive teaching methods, had initially been met with skepticism by the mountain community. Now several neighboring families sent their children to join Thomas's lessons 3 times weekly in the community church. "And your mother's formulations for the first product line?" Edmund inquired as they walked toward the cabin. "She's finalized 3, the cough remedy, the burn salve, and the digestive tonic. She's still perfecting the rheumatism treatment." Thomas had taken naturally to his role in the business, absorbing both his mother's traditional knowledge and Edmund's business principles with equal enthusiasm. Inside the cabin, Sarah sat at a new desk near the window, where sunlight illuminated the journal in which she recorded her precise formulations. Her health had improved steadily under Dr. Harrison's care and with better living conditions. Though still thin, color had returned to her cheeks and her breathing was less labored. "Mr. Blackwell," she greeted him, closing her journal. "Right on schedule, as always." Edmund smiled, checking his pocket watch out of habit. "Punctuality is a virtue in business, Mrs. Mason. Speaking of which, I've brought the finalized packaging designs for your approval." He unrolled several detailed drawings on the table, elegant labels for bottles and tins, featuring a silhouette of the mountains and the name they had agreed upon. "Mason's Mountain Remedies, Nature's Wisdom, since 1823. The date honors your husband's family's arrival in these mountains," Edmund explained. "Establishes heritage and authenticity for urban customers." Sarah studied the designs with a critical eye. "They're beautiful, but will city folks really pay such prices for mountain medicine?" "Indeed they will," Edmund assured her, "particularly with physician endorsements. Dr. Harrison has agreed to write an article for the medical journal about the efficacy of certain traditional treatments, mentioning your formulations specifically. Outside, the construction team called for Thomas's assistance in identifying the best location for the herb drying racks. The boy excused himself, clearly enjoying his role in the building process. "He's flourishing," Sarah observed once Thomas had gone. "I've never seen him so animated, so full of purpose." Edmund nodded. "He has a remarkable mind, equally at home with literature, business concepts, and botanical knowledge. The Academy in Charleston would welcome him next year, when you feel he's ready." Sarah's expression clouded slightly. "That would take him far from home. Only temporarily," Edmund assured her, "and only if you both agree it's best. There are many paths his education might take. They turn their attention to business matters, production schedules, distribution arrangements through the railroad, financial projections." Sarah had proven herself not just a healer, but a shrewd business partner, quickly grasping concepts that had taken Edmund years to master. "The first shipment to Simmons' apothecary is prepared," Sarah reported. 20 bottles of the cough remedy and 15 tins of the salve. "A modest beginning. Every successful enterprise starts with a single transaction," Edmund replied. "Remember, I began with one small investment in a sailing ship. Patience and reinvestment built everything else. Later, as Edmund prepared to depart for his return to Coleridge Junction, where he now kept a permanent office, Thomas approached with a small package wrapped in brown paper. A gift. "Mr. Blackwell," the boy said somewhat shyly. From Ma and me. Edmund unwrapped it carefully to reveal a handsomely crafted wooden box containing 3 small bottles, each labeled in Sarah's precise handwriting, "For your travels," Thomas explained. The green one helps with digestion when eating unfamiliar food. The amber prevents fever, and the clear one, he hesitated, a hint of his old shyness returning. Ma made that one specially for easing grief. She said sometimes old sorrows need gentle medicine too. Edmund stared at the small bottle, unexpectedly moved by the thoughtfulness behind it. "This is most considerate, Thomas. Please thank your mother for me." As his carriage pulled away, Edmund found himself reflecting on the changes of the past months. What had begun as a simple business opportunity had evolved into something far more meaningful. The mountain boy who had sacrificed. His coat for his mother's medicine had opened. A door for Edmund as well, a door leading back to the human connections he had walled himself off from after Elizabeth's death. In his pocket, the wooden box with its 3 bottles represented something money couldn't purchase, genuine care from people who owed him nothing beyond their business partnership. Perhaps, Edmund thought as the carriage wound down the newly improved mountain road, Sarah's remedies might indeed heal more than physical ailments. 1 year later, autumn painted the mountains in brilliant hues of red and gold. The transformation of the Mason property was complete. The expanded home stood proudly on the mountainside, its generous windows reflecting the morning sunlight. Behind it, the greenhouse gleamed like a jewel, sheltering rare medicinal plants through the changing seasons. Inside the office that had once been the original cabin's main room, Edmund and Thomas bent over a document spread across a polished oak desk. The partnership agreement, formally establishing Mason Mountain Remedies as a registered company, was ready for final signatures. The distribution network now includes 17 apothecaries across 4 states, Edmund noted with satisfaction. And the railroad connection has reduced delivery times to urban markets by 60%. Thomas nodded, reviewing the quarterly figures with the careful attention Edmund had instilled in him. At 14, the boy had grown taller, his frame filling out thanks to proper nutrition and reduced physical hardship. His education had progressed remarkably under Mr. Collins' tutelage, combined with practical business lessons from Edmund and continuing instruction in traditional medicine from Sarah. "The wild ginger tincture is outselling our projections," Thomas observed. "Mother thinks we should increase cultivation in the south field next spring." The door opened as Sarah entered, carrying a tray with tea. Her recovery had exceeded Dr. Harrison's most optimistic predictions. Though she would never regain the robust health of her youth, careful management of her condition had stabilized her breathing and restored much of her strength. She now divided her time between formulating remedies, teaching her knowledge to a small group of apprentices from neighboring families, and overseeing the growing gardens. "The Williamson order is packed and ready for tomorrow's train," she reported, setting down the tray. "Their last letter said our remedies are now requested by name." Edmund accepted a cup of tea, a special blend Sarah had created to improve mental clarity. "Excellent news. Brand recognition is developing precisely as we projected." He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope. "This arrived from Charleston yesterday. I thought you and Thomas should open it together." Sarah glanced at the envelope's official seal, the Charleston Academy for Exceptional Studies. She handed it to Thomas, whose hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. "Dear Mr. Mason," he read aloud, his voice steady despite his obvious excitement. "We are pleased to inform you that your application for the spring semester has been accepted with full scholarship." He looked up, eyes bright with possibility. "Congratulations, Thomas," Edmund said warmly. "Their science program is unparalleled, and the headmaster has agreed to your special circumstances. Home visits monthly and summers here to continue your practical education in traditional medicine." Sarah's eyes glistened with unshed tears, pride mingled with the natural concern of a mother facing her child's first significant departure from home. "Your father would be so proud of you," she said softly. Thomas carefully refolded the letter. "I couldn't have done this without both of you," he acknowledged, including Edmund in his glance. Edmund shook his head. "The potential was always yours, Thomas. Opportunity merely revealed it." Sarah poured more tea, her movements deliberate. "Speaking of opportunity, Mr. Blackwell, I've been meaning to ask about your Boston affairs. Surely your extended presence in our mountains has affected your other business interests." Edmund smiled, fingering his ever-present pocket watch. "A fair question. Initially, I maintained my Boston schedule through telegraph and courier. But I've discovered something unexpected. I prefer the pace of life here." He glanced around the room that still contained elements of the original cabin, despite its transformation. "I've relocated my primary office permanently to Coleridge Junction." Both Sarah and Thomas looked surprised by this revelation. "The railroad continues to thrive without my daily oversight," Edmund continued, "and I find greater satisfaction in developing this enterprise. There's something rewarding about creating something that genuinely helps people, rather than merely moving goods from one place to another." Sarah studied him thoughtfully. "And your home in Boston?" "Maintained but seldom visited." Edmund's expression softened. Elizabeth would have appreciated the irony. "I spent years building a mansion I now find too empty to enjoy, while discovering unexpected contentment in these mountains she never saw." The afternoon sun streamed through windows that hadn't existed a year earlier, illuminating the partnership document, awaiting their signatures. Edmund uncapped his fountain pen and signed with the flourish that had authorized countless business transactions throughout his career. He passed the pen to Sarah, who signed her name with careful dignity, then to Thomas, whose signature had evolved from a boy's uncertain scrawl to a young man's confident hand. "To Mason Mountain Remedies," Edmund proposed, raising his teacup in a toast, "where tradition meets progress." "And to Open Doors," Thomas added quietly, meeting Edmund's gaze with understanding beyond his years. Outside, a carriage approached on the smooth road that had replaced the treacherous path where Thomas and Edmund had first encountered each other during a storm. The driver was Phillips, still in Edmund's employ, but now familiar with every bend of the mountain roads. He slowed as he passed a young boy walking barefoot along the roadside, carrying a small bundle of herbs. Edmund watched through the window, reminded of Thomas a year earlier. Perhaps, he thought, another door waited to be opened.